Hello, my name's Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to be looking at a simple wet-on-wet technique for painting autumn leaves. This tutorial is particularly useful for new or beginner watercolor artists, but if you're a more experienced artist, you may also find some useful tips as well. Usually I wet the back of the paper when painting my watercolors, but in this case, as it's quite a small shape and I'm not going to be painting the background at all, I'm not going to wet the back. This is meant to be a quick exercise. The drawing doesn't have to be very accurate. So let's start by mixing the colours. So I've got some yellow, some of the reds, a little bit of the green, and then the dark brown for the edges. So we'll start with the cad yellow. Just test that colour. That's nice. We don't have to match the colours exactly. And this is Scarlet Lake. It's a lot brighter than what's in our reference. So we'll just add a small amount of burnt sienna to that. Still a bit too bright, so a little bit of cobalt blue. That will dull it fractionally. Good. And for the green colour, just some of the cad yellow, a little bit of cobalt turquoise. Now I've got way more than I need there, but it can just sit there. And then just some French ultramarine and burnt sienna for the dark around the edges. I don't want this to be too watery because I don't want it to flow into the other colours too much. Make it even thicker still, just to minimise the risk of that. I've mixed a lot more than I need, but it's easy for you to see these colours when I have this quantity. And I always prefer to mix more than I need. What we're going to do first is start with a wash of the dominant colour, which is this yellow. It's also our brightest colour. And we're going to paint the whole shape with that. Now, because I haven't wet the back of this, I need to paint reasonably fast, because I have to go in with the other colours while this is still wet. Now I'll go into my reds and look at where there is red in the reference. Now I can already see that this area is drying fairly quickly, so a good tip is to have a spray bottle handy and just give it a light spray. And I'm spraying away over the top of the paper, not into the paper. That way only the lightest drops land on the paper and they're attracted to the wet areas of the painting. And you can see how now this is no longer dull but has a little bit of a shine. So that says to me it's a good stage to be painting this wet on wet technique. Again, just use the reference as inspiration. You don't have to paint every little mark. I keep a towel handy and I use that to take moisture out of my brush when I'm painting. There's some green down here, so let's just drop some of that in. I want this to be darker in tone still, so let's remove some of this. If you have too big a puddle, it takes too much paint to thicken it up. Here I'm just going to mix the Scarlet Lake, some Cad Yellow, and a small amount of the Cobalt Blue. Just lifting some of this excess moisture. If you leave it there, this area takes too long to dry and the next stage becomes more difficult. You can move the board around if you want to make the paint flow in a different direction. There's a few little marks that splatter some paint there. Got to be careful you don't end up with too much paint on white paper, however. I want to go in with a thicker paint to do the edges now. I'll lift some more of this excess moisture again. Remember, when you're painting with watercolour, the key ingredient is the water. And what does water do? My board is at an angle of 20 degrees, so the water and the paint will flow down the paper. That's why every now and then you'll see me twisting my border around if I'm not happy with how the paint is flowing. Don't want this to be black, more of a dark colour leaning a little bit to the brown. Vary the thickness of this paint so you get a more interesting edge. This line here is a bit too solid, so I'll just clean my brush, take most of the moisture out of my brush and lift some of that. And I'll go back in with some of this red colour as well. More yellow up here. When you're happy with the overall pattern of colours on your leaf, let it dry, because the next stage will be a wet and dry step. Once the surface has lost its shine, you can dry it with a hairdryer without risking moving all the paint around, which can dull the painting. We can now come in and paint the wet on dry edges. I'll start with the vein, this main vein on the leaf. You need a brush with a good point when doing this. So for some of these fainter lines, I'll mix a little bit of this dark brown with some of the yellow. And these lines have a little bit of green in them. Again, I didn't bother cleaning my brush before going into the green because these colours aren't very bright, so that little bit of that brown colour will dull the green nicely. And this stem has some nice redness to it, so I'll lift some of this darker paint. Pick up some of the red and burnt sienna. There's a little highlight there, so we'll lift some paint from that side. You don't want to overdo these little wet on dry sections. Really just using them to break up some of these flatter or less interesting shapes. Now, one last thing I'll show you. If we look at the reference, you'll see there are some of these lighter veins. They're not very distinct, so it's not worth masking them before you paint the subject. It just makes the painting too complex. What I do, if you want to achieve a similar effect to what's in the reference, is just get some clean water, use a thin brush, like a rigger like this is handy, and just paint it in with water. Wait about 30 seconds and then get a tissue, just dab. Obviously the rest of the painting has to be dry when you do this, otherwise you'll lift the paint. This is not meant to be a botanical exercise, it's just to show you a technique. Nearly done. It's just a bit more darkness around here, so I'm just putting in some colour and then just softening the edges with some clean water. Not too much water on my brush. That will give it a little bit more form. You can use it in other areas too. Now we're done. If you want to see more of these simpler paintings, please leave a comment below and I'll endeavour to produce more of them. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be advised of each new video I produce. And if you are able to, please consider supporting me on my Patreon channel. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.